A než začnu, chtěl bych vás poprosit, abyste mi dovolili mluvit anglicky. Bude někomu překážet? Ne. Tak dobře, tak děkuji. Tak to tuším bude rychlejší. A asi smysl úplnější. Ale než začnu, měl bych se nejdřív omluvit za to, že když jste přečetli ten svůj abstrakt, tak měl jsem tam 4 přípravé studie. A bohužel tedy teď budu prezentovat jenom 3. A je to právě Slovensko, které vypadlo. tak určitě někoho budu s tím zklamat, ale jistě budu jenom vítat to, že když v diskusi potom můžeme mluvit i o slovenské realitě. So these are the questions that I was most interested in when I decided to take on this study. And as you can see, I'm particularly interested in Bourdieu's concept of the field, and I'm interested in what it means to study a field at a very particular point in its development, at a point when it's mobilized politically. That's the theoretical question, if you like. The empirical question is the other way around. How does field theory help us explain things like the formation of groups, social technology through which people delegate power to others, and so on? And finally, then there's a methodological question that interested me, and that was what data and methods would we need to do all this? So that's just to tell you where I'm coming from. The empirical object of my interest is the observation that throughout Europe there have been a lot of protests recently from the academic world about changes to the way in which research is governed, funded and evaluated, either by the state or by higher education institutions themselves. And the leitmotif of these protests has often been the defence of academic autonomy. Autonomy is an important concept for Bourdieu. Of course, it's important for all fields of cultural production in his theory. And I've taken from his theory 3 basic principles, 3 conditions, if you like, that need to be fulfilled before we can talk about autonomy. We need to be able to say that a cultural producer has control over the production of knowledge in very practical ways, things like the actual processes, the technicalities of knowledge production, the pace of their work, are they independent in determining the pace of their work, the conditions of entry to a particular field, whether that's in the hands of the cultural producers themselves or somebody else. And that all amounts to, if you like, an ethos of art for art's sake. Bourdieu often used the term l'art pour l'art in his book Le Règle de l'art, for example. But the second precondition for autonomy is control of the uses of knowledge. And that means, if you like, managing the heteronomy that all fields have to some degree or other. So it's managing the relationships between the field that you're in and the other social fields of the social world, and in particular, of course, the field of power. And you might think of that as an ethos of public service, of the innovator. It's the idea that you're doing something which has a value in other fields as well, but doing it as a public service provides you with a sense of autonomy. I'll come back to this later. But and finally, the third condition that I think is to do with representing and refracting knowledge. Refraction is a term that Bourdieu uses a lot to characterize the way in which the external constraints which apply to the production of culture in a field are, in a more autonomous field, refracted, if you like, through the certain criteria, certain standards that field is able to apply, if you like, to translate a set of external constraints into internal constraints. And perhaps I'm going to suggest later that that's done through setting up arenas of critical discussion between fields. I'm going to have to go very quickly through some of these beginning slides, so I'll talk around them rather than go through every single point. But the context that I'm suggesting is relevant to thinking about the evaluation of academic research and the protests that have arisen around that are a sense of greater heteronomy, a greater external constraints, larger, stronger external constraints on the academic world from outside. Things like there are new markets and audiences for research, there are new potential sponsors. Some of these you'll see raise new opportunities as well as constraints. But within the academic world as well, there is the rise of what's sometimes called in a lot of, certainly in a lot of UK writing on this, the audit culture in higher education institutions and other administrations, and the idea of that a managerialist discourse has overtaken both the way in which higher education institutions are managed internally by university management, for example, but also externally by government and other evaluators and regulators. Okay, I need to move on quickly. Research evaluation is obviously a topic which begs application of Bourdieu's ideas, because if we're thinking about a field, what fields do above anything else is evaluate. That's what defines a field. Professionals in any field are constantly evaluating one another. In the academic world, we talk mostly about peer review as the system, but it applies to any field of cultural production. That's the sense of value that's created by the interaction of cultural producers is absolutely crucial to the identity of the field. But there's also a sense when we talk about research evaluation that we're meaning something external as well. We're not just meaning peer review, we're also referring to criteria which are increasingly imposed upon researchers to justify what they do to somebody else, to justify what they do, let's say, in terms of market value, in terms of public value, maybe in terms of social or economic value, and increasingly also in terms of expert evaluation. Thinking in the Czech Republic, the large Technopolis report, which was produced recently, was an interesting example of the rise of evaluation agencies operating internationally quite often, which could be described as a field of themselves. And the fact that there's a market for expert evaluation of research indicates that there's a demand from somewhere for applying something other than the normal mechanisms of peer review. The question that the balance, if you like, between external and internal evaluation, from the researcher's point of view, comes down to what you might call purification or impurification. If I pursue a strategy of purification, then the only thing that matters to me is the value of the people who are part of the same field as me, my peers. A strategy of impurification is a strategy that says I need to justify myself externally to others as well. I'll come back to that later. I want to now go through two quick slides which give me two questions that I'm then going to ask about my case studies. When a field mobilizes, in a sense it loses its coherence. You could almost say that it stops being a field. When Bourdieu writes about the formation of groups and representation of groups, he deals with identity that a sense of identity that cuts across fields and very often unites positions within different fields. It's often the time when he appeals to that idea of homology. The identity you get within a group is often from being in a similar position to somebody in another field, rather than a sense of belonging to the field that you're in. So when fields mobilize, it's questionable whether we really are looking at fields in the normal sense, or whether we actually, some of the groups that are forming cut across those fields. And that's because they often coincide with moments of field renewal, when a field is reinvented, when new rules, new criteria of value are invented, when new generations maybe challenge the orthodoxy of the old generation. it's a theme which we've had in a number of the presentations today, so I won't go back to it again. But I want to ask that question about each of the case studies I'm coming to in a minute. Are we looking at a moment of field renewal? The other question I ask about them is to do with this kind of riddle of the title of my presentation, which is dependence and independence, or independence and dependence. Comes from a phrase that Bourdieu uses in a book called Les usages sociaux de la science, which is a kind of a practical extension of Homo academicus. He's thinking through the relationships there between an applied research institute, INRA, the Agricultural Research Institute of France, with users of that research. And he's saying that you can never tell whether it's one or the other, basically. He's saying essentially classically one of the reasons why we can say that academic research is a relatively autonomous, independent sphere of activity is precisely because it's dependent on the state. It's dependent on the state for the guarantee of that space of independence. I want to suggest very tentatively that we might be moving from a situation like that, where the self-regulation of the field is dependent on the institutional and financial guarantees of the state, to one where it's almost the other way around. Academia is becoming more dependent on not just the state, but other external consecrators, like experts in evaluation. It has to justify itself more and more to an external audience, in other words. It has to do so, in other words, partly to generate the conditions of its own independence, because it's asked, in the crudest sense, it's asked to be income generating, or it's asked to be self-sustainable in terms of income. So to some extent you've got a financial withdrawal of the state, or if the state does provide financial resources, they're often more conditional than in the past on some form of accountability. So it might be, so I'm just playing with those words a little bit to ask whether we're moving from one situation to another, and what that would amount to is that the terms of the independence are being renegotiated. Okay. So some contrasting case studies. I'm going to deal very quickly, even more quickly than I wanted to, with 3 case studies. There they are. Those are my 2 questions I'm going to ask about each of them. What are they? In France, I'm dealing with a protest movement called Sauvons la Recherche. These, I won't go through this first slide, and there's an equivalent first slide for each of my case studies in much detail at all. These, I've just sort of indicated the types of background issues which I would want to explore in more detail if I were doing this research, if this research was more than exploratory. So I'd want to look at the whole background of science-society relations in France, looking, for example, at picking out things like the particular status that science has as a sense of public service, and the researcher as a public servant in France, which I think is unusual. You'd want to look at the history, the structure of the scientific field, and perhaps picking out the unusual relationship between pure research and university research in France, which of course has a certain parallels in Czech Republic and Slovakia as well, but certainly not in the UK, where almost all research is university-based, effectively. There are certain changes into science and education policies since the 1990s, and they're more or less similar across the different countries. They're all about the rise of managerialism, accountability, decreases in job security, and so on. Okay, so Sauvons la Recherche. It arose in 2004. It was a petition signed by 75,000 academic signatories. If they were all researchers, that would represent 45% of all paid researchers in France, so that's a pretty significant amount, but also more than 300,000 citizen signatories. It was led by lab directors who threatened to resign en masse, so you could say it was a movement of the dominant in certain respects, led by certain disciplines, the physical and the life sciences, a split perhaps between organised and popular wings, which to some extent corresponds between older and younger researchers. Younger researchers much more active on the streets, older researchers much more trying to use official channels of influence to lobby for changes in legislation. So was this a moment of field renewal? Briefly, not really, but in some small ways. Not really because it was, as I say, a movement that was led by the dominant, but then again, it was led by the dominant because they managed to include some of the demands of young researchers in the demands that they put forward, and therefore, particularly with returns in relation to job security. But I'll come back to reasons, to my reservations about that later in a final slide. Were they successfully renegotiating dependence and independence? Well, at the time there was the establishment of a state of new institutional intermediaries between the fields. A new evaluation agency and a new research funding agency were some of the outcomes of Sylvain La Recherche, which the government created as a response to the EGR, which is États Généraux de la Recherche, a discussion process that was begun on the back of that. But the movement continued because the movement felt very strongly that its demands had been misused, abused by the government, and therefore the deal which it had struck was not the deal which it was looking for. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move on very, very briefly about these. What can I say in a few sentences about the UK campaign, Stand Up for Research? This was very strongly a campaign for a change to the situation, the way in which research is evaluated in the UK. It was a petition against the proposal to evaluate not only the quality of research, but the social and economic impact of research in the new national evaluation system of the UK. These are some numbers about how many people signed it. It was a movement which was led by the main trade union organisation for researchers, so it was quite an official protest movement. And naturally, given the topic, the main division which played out was between basic and applied researchers, because applied researchers obviously saw something positive in the government proposals, whereas basic researchers tended to see more negatives. Was it a moment of field renewal? Well, not really, because on the whole, it was a Pyrrhic victory for those who wanted to retain the old system of research evaluation. The value of this impact element was reduced in the proposals, and the fact that measuring the social and economic impact of research had to be secondary to measuring the quality of research was re-emphasised. But that, of course, meant that certain marginal players who were actually quite positive about these were effectively excluded from the debate. Was it renegotiating dependence and independence? I think, yes, it could be. It could be quite considerably, because the research evaluation framework could be established as something what I call an arena for critical discussion. I won't go more into that, because I've written a paper about that, and if anybody's more interested, I can give you the references to that, or send you a copy. In the last few minutes that remain, I've got to try and talk a little bit about the Czech equivalent, which I've focused on the movement Věda žije, which was quite a different movement in a way. It was based in the Academy of Sciences, and it was initiated by young researchers. So you could say that this was very much a movement by outsiders within the field, perhaps. But then again, it was defending the position of the Academy of Sciences as a unique institution, which was felt to be under threat from changes to the way in which Czech government research was being funded at the time. And we're talking about the year 2009. These are the numbers again. Věda žije claims to represent all disciplines and very much sort of self-styled itself as an open platform for debate about the future of research policy. But interestingly, when spokespeople were interviewed in the media, they were pressed by the media to define themselves, to pin themselves down in terms of who they spoke for. Were they the voice for a particular section of the establishment? Were they speaking against the universities? Were they speaking against older researchers? They were forced to position themselves like that. Was it a moment of field renewal? Well, yes, in the sense that it was very much a group of outsiders, and that they mobilised the impact agenda to criticise, in particular, the way metrics play a very important role in the evaluation of Czech research. Were they renegotiating dependence and independence? Well, less so than in the other cases, I think, because there's very much an absence of arenas of critical discussion which were trusted. The Czech Council for Research Evaluation is a place which is usually dismissed as too dominated by partial interests to serve in that respect. Right at the very end, I'm going to skip to two concluding slides. One is here about field renewal. So my summary is that France was essentially a movement of the dominant to defend their position, but they did so by including outsiders. So in that sense, they were able to change the way in which the field worked to some extent. In the UK, it was also a movement of the dominant, but defending their position. But they excluded outsiders more, and so there was a barrier to field renewal. In the Czech Republic, there were protests, but without really challenging the orthodoxy. Renegotiating dependence and independence, and I'm afraid the bottom's fallen off that slide. France, it was a movement which shifted the dialogue with the state to an alliance of social actors. In the UK, it was a movement which played off social and state support against one another, interestingly mobilising one and then the other against the other. And I'm just wondering if you could see it if I did that. In the Czech Republic, anyway, it was more of a defensive movement to combat the threat to independence from outside. And then finally, I want to just point to a few, oh dear, I have to go through them all, am I? A few conclusions that I draw for field theory itself. Testing field theory using limit cases when the field is in a state of mobilisation, critical situations, which Bourdieua often talked about. I think who was it? Pandlask earlier made the point in his presentation about that they were useful, that the phases in which generational renewal took place were useful times to look at fields. I think in some ways that's true, precisely because they're moments when the very existence of a field is not taken for granted by its members, and because of that, the rules of the game have to be made explicit. Because of that, also, they tend to be. You tend to look at moments when actors have to make what Bourdieua called their prise de position. They have to position themselves to say who they speak from and where they are. And there are moments when the game breaks down and actors are forced to become. Bourdieua talks about being cynical. He doesn't mean that in a pejorative sense. What he means is that they lose that sense of the game, that instinctive sense of the game. And because of that, they have to actually name the rules of the game and go into negotiation about what the rules of the game are. So we catch actors at their most reflexive about the rules of the game. And because of that, we might learn something about how field renewal occurs as internal and external crises affect the field simultaneously. And finally, we might also learn something about the conditions of cultural reproduction and the autonomy that's conditional on are renegotiated between the field of cultural production and the field of power.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Děkuji moc a otevírám diskusi od 3 do 5 minut. No, možná, že 10, to už je jedno. Kým se rozmyslíte, já mám hned první otázku, co mě napadlo, jestli ta samotná reflexivita vědy, jo, to je prostě jako tyhle hnutí můžeme taky chápat jako určité jakoby formy jednání, které přispívají právě k té reflexivitě pole. Nutně nevede k cynismu, právě k tomu cynickému zjeznání. A z toho jakoby jakákoliv forma reflexe těch pravidel a formální nevede odstupu k tomu, od té iluzie, od toho iluzio.
No, myslím, že o to jde. A několikrát se to už zmínilo dnes, že to je to postavení, to zvláštní postavení sociologa, že? Že on není, on je a zároveň není součástí té hry. A právě to je dobrá analoga, protože myslím, že ta institucionalizovaná reflexe, která se děje okolo vědní politice ve všech těch zemích, svým způsobem jakoby nučí všichni účastníky té pole stát se sociology. To je dobré, protože je to skutečně hodně cynicismu, aspoň v britské debatě o hodnocení výzkumu. Ale možná, že je dobrá sami nám připomenout, že cynicismus v bourdieuském smyslu není pejorativní pojem.
Ano.
Dobře jsem pochopil, že v té Francii tam hlavně byly zapojené přírodní a technické vědy v tom protestu. Že to jim přijde zvláštní.
Technické spíš ne, ale klinické, jako medicínské.
Více než sociální.
A fyzické.
Více
než sociální.
Čím si to vysvětluje, že většinou teda v našem prostředí se zdá, že více kritičtí jsou tím reformám sociální vědci, jak to, že v té Francii to tak nebylo. V čem se liší to pole, nebo v čem ta reflexe byla?
To je dobrá otázka a nevím, jestli co je víc než náhoda, protože ten způsob, jak se organizoval to hnutí ve Francii, se dělo na základě místních vazeb, spíš než disciplinárních vazeb. Čili organizovat a hlavně v Paříži, v Lyoně a pak se potom propojili. A nějak to nejprve schopili vůči nebo jak direktor šéfové laboratorie v přírodních a medicínských vědách. A protože oni se jakoby vzpourali nejprve, to trochu odrazilo sociální vědce, aby se do toho pojavili. Čili velmi rychle je to zajímavé, že se kultivuje nějaká skupinová identita, který se dokázali dát tvář či původní lidi. Ale nevím, já bych do toho nečetl příliš, já bych nedal příliš velkou váhu tomu, že konkrétně tyto disciplínové skopili ten protest. Spíš zajímavé je, že poté, co se skopili ten protest se získal jejich ráz.
Žádná další otázka, jak vidím. Zuzana.
Teda, aký byl ten slovenský příklad, který jsi študoval?
Já jsem chtěl, chtěl jsem nejprve vzít petici Zachraňme vědu, ale to byl spíš, to se netýkalo hodnocení vědy samozřejmě, to se týkalo financování vědy. Pro ty, kteří to neznáte, to šlo o návrh přesunout část prostředků ze strukturálních fond vědy a výzkum do strukturálních fondů pro dopravu. A potom se mi taky zdálo, že může být zajímavé brát diskusy, které se týkala návrhu nového zákona o vysokých školách. Ale který trochu víc se týká to hodnocení, ale zase to není úplně totéž. A proto jsem vynechal to Slovensko, protože na Slovensko ty debaty byly spíš jednak o financí a jednak o statusu vědce a vědě. Zatímco ty ostatní případy, ta otázka hodnocení byla ten ústřední motiv těch protestů. Tak proto jsem nechal Slovensko debatu.
Taký komentár, že to je zaujímavé pochopenie toho okamihu ako cynický okamih. Aj keď chápem, že to nie je pejoratívne, ale že práve by som asi myslel, že vtedy sú ľudia najrozhorení, že budú rečniť o veľkých ilúziách, ktoré majú o tom, ako veda je veľmi dobrá vec a takto, že neviem, či všeobecne sa dá povedať, že možno práve vtedy, keď ľudia...
A že to je špatná doba, obvykle se říká, že je to špatná doba na diskusi, když lidi jsou rozhorčení, anebo to myslíte?
Iba, že či to... Normálne by som myslel, že práve vtedy, keď najviac sú emocionálne zapojení do nejakého diskurzu, keď je sociálne hnutie, ako keby, že vtedy by boli menej by rozprávali o tých pravidlách hry, ale možno v tých prípadoch nie je to pravda, že práve vtedy, keď vtedy sú vedomí.
Pro Bourdieua to je otázka mezi těmi dvěmi slovy, který používal iluziou a iluze. Jo, čili když jsem ve hře a mám dokonalý cit po hře, po hru, tak ovládá mě iluziou, protože nemusím reflektovat o tom. A když nemám cit pro hru, tak můžu jedině tehdy můžu vidět ty iluze, které se jinak se mi zdá jako samozřejmostí. A pro Bourdieua to je jednak, to může být znak outsiderství, že nepatřím k tomu hře, protože patřím k jiné pole, ale taky to může být vlastně takový odstup, který mám dočasně od té hry. To může být nástroj, jak získávám odstup, abych mohl ještě líp rozumět té hře a možná v tomto případě zreformovat tu hry, zlepšovat tu hry, které nazýváme hodnocení vědy v tom případě.
A zároveň asi tiež treba, aby ľudia sa mobilizovali, musia aj byť v hre. Takže zároveň...
Myslím, že ne. Protože když se mobilizují, často se děje, že mobilizují na základě té homologii. Čili to bylo vidět v některých těch protestech, kdy se dělaly nejrůznější, obzvlášť ve Francii, že dělala nejrůznější alianci mezi skupiny, které obhájily zájmy vědců a skupiny, které obhájily zájmy jiných, které kulturních pracovníků, nebo zdravotníků, nebo učitelů ve střední škole. A taky ve Česku byly demonstrace, kde Věda žije organizovala demonstraci společně s organizací, které zastávaly práva kulturních pracovníků, tuším. Takže tehdy se mobilizoval na základ pozice, který spíš než na základě patřičnosti k určitému poli.